Liam Mellows has frequently been held up as one of the great lost leaders of Irish Republican socialism. In this talk, what I'd like to do is entitled Liam Mellows and the Lost Soul of Irish Republican Socialism. I'd actually like to talk about his later life. He was executed by the Free State government in December of 1922. He was one of 81 men executed by the Free State during the course of the Civil War in Ireland that lasted from the end of June 1922 until April of 1923. So in this talk, I'd like for the first part to give an overview of his life and times, his background, his activities in the IRA, and then focus on his Republican socialist period in the latter part of his life and debates and events that occurred in that action-packed last few months of his time on Earth. So in terms of background, Liam Mellows was a central figure in the Irish Republican movement in both Ireland and the United States. From his first involvement with the Republican Boy Scouts, Na Fianna Éireann, actually founded in Belfast in 1909, until his execution at the height of the Civil War by the Free State on the 8th of December 1922. Mellows, of course, was executed alongside three other Republicans, one of whom, Joe McKelvey, of course, was from West Belfast. A full-time organiser initially for the Republican Boy Scouts, Na Fianna Éireann, he would have worked closely with Bulmer Hobson, of course, from North Belfast, a Quaker graduate of St. Malachy's College. And Na Fianna was a movement that would provide a coterie of officers for the Republican movement and for the IRA later on. Mellows initially championed this idea of national salvation of Ireland through the insurrection of the young. He was a member of the first executive then of the Irish Volunteers, founded in November 1913, and was appointed national organiser for the organisation, and was at the forefront of the movement's preparations for the 1916 rebellion. He was dispatched to Galway in October 1914, alongside another Belfast man, actually, Alfred O'Monaghan, who lived in Balfour Avenue and was originally from Short Strand. Along with O'Monaghan, he was to lead over 500 volunteers in the doomed Galway Rising, where he commanded an army bereft of desperately needed rifles from the ill-fated German steamship the Aud. It would be the first bitter disappointment amongst a litany of personal disasters that was to follow. In the aftermath of Easter week, Mellows was essentially exiled in New York for 4 years as a representative of the IRA, where he was tasked by the leadership with helping secure money, arms and political support for the coming revolution at home. Styled Commandant Mellows, his time in the United States was deeply unhappy. He suffered emotionally and for a period was confined to his bed, malnourished, and in fact cared for by the women of Cummin. He was jailed in the infamous Tombs prison, while his comrades in the American Fenian organisation, Clan na Gael, dithered over whether to pay his bail or not, and he was eventually shunned and vilified by the American Fenians. And worst of all, labelled an informer in 1917 by no less than the mayor of New York himself, John Puroy Mitchell, who happened to be the grandson of the famed 19th century revolutionary and Young Ireland leader, John Mitchell. Upon his return to Ireland in November 1920, Mellows then became a member of the GHQ of the IRA at the height of the War of Independence, with direct responsibility for the procurement of arms and explosives, largely from Europe, which was awash with weapons, and also principally from the port cities of Glasgow and Liverpool. This role entailed dangerous liaisons with arms dealers and supporters in Britain. Distrustful of the leader Michael Collins, who he felt was undermining him, this position demanded absolute secrecy from Mellows, and his activities during this year 1920 and 21 remain shrouded in mystery. Bitterly opposed to the Anglo Irish Treaty that would end the War of Independence, Liam Mellows was one of the most influential hardline Republican opponents of Michael Collins's agreement. His role in occupying the forecourts with the anti-treaty IRA leadership in April 1922 was central to the events that led to the outbreak of the Irish Civil War. He was captured in the bombardment of the building by the Free State at the end of the month and executed months later in December, alongside Richard Barrett, a West Cork man, Joe McKelvey, a West Belfast man, and Rory O'Connor of South Dublin in Mountjoy Jail in the retaliation for an attack on two pro-treaty members of Dáil Éireann, in which TD Sean Hales of Cork was killed the previous night. It's worth remembering that during the Irish Civil War, as I said, 81 people were executed by the Free State government, 77 Republicans and 4 non-political prisoners. If we're to put that in comparison, for instance, to the events after 1916, the British, of course, famously executed 16 leaders, creating this well of support and sympathy. The British government actually executed less than 20 members of the IRA during the War of Independence. The level of extrajudicial, in some cases, and what they termed judicial killing of prisoners by the Free State greatly exceeded that of the British that preceded it during this period. So if that was a very brief overview of Mellows' life, it's interesting to take a look at his youth and background, because Mellows' life was a triumph of reinvention. He was actually born in Hartshead Military Barracks in Ashton-under-Lyne, which is in Lancashire in England, in the north of England, in 1892, to Sergeant William Mellows of the British Army, who was originally of Callan, County Kilkenny, and his wife Sarah Jordan of Monalug in North Wexford. Christened William Joseph after both his father and his grandfather, and known as Willie to his family and friends, he adopted Liam, the Irish version of his Christian name, in adolescence. Liam's father, William, remarkably, was also born in a military barracks, when Liam's grandfather was serving overseas with the British Army in Gonda in northern India. And it was hoped fervently that Liam would become the third generation of his family to serve in the British military. So the son of a man serving in the military, born in a barracks, who himself was the son of a man serving in the military, born in a British barracks. It was the Mellows family's hope that Liam would break through the glass ceiling concerning class, and that Mellows would eventually become an officer. And to this end, they invest heavily in his education, aspiring for him to become, if you like, something in the military that they could never achieve due to their humble background. So the Mellows family lived a transient existence in their youth, as their father was transferred from Fermoy in Cork to Manchester and to Glasgow and elsewhere. Liam himself was a sickly child and was sent to stay for long periods with his maternal grandparents in North Wexford. And this was have an enduring influence on his life, as he was in North Wexford during the centenary of the 1798 rebellion and witnessed much of the commemoration and celebration of same. Mellows' schooling was interrupted by the family's constant uprooting, and his formative education, however, was gained at British military schools attached to the Wellington Barracks in Cork, which subsequently became Collins Barracks, Portobello Barracks in Dublin, of course, which subsequently became named after his comrade, Cathal Brugha, and the Royal Hibernian Military School in Dublin. By the age of 18, however, despite the aspirations of his father, Liam had already turned his back on the family's British military aspirations. And alongside his brother Herbert, William and Herbert reinvented themselves as Liam and Barney, Republican revolutionaries, through their involvement in the Irish Republican Brotherhood, first of all, and the Fianna Boy Scouts, second of all. It's at this period, around 1910, that it's actually Tom Clark, who is to die, of course, after the 1916 Rising, the Fenian leader, who had spent over a decade in English jails, lived for a time in Long Island in New York afterwards, who became a second father figure, or maybe even a replacement father figure to Liam Mellows, and very much tutors him in the way of physical force and militarism as the sole solution to Ireland's problems. So Mellows shared Patrick Pearse's faith at this time in the youth of Ireland and his despair at the constitutional nationalism of older Irish generations. And this led him to invest his energy very much in young people. To a Republican militant was to be in a small minority, however. And as Mellows later recalled, the dream of revolution in these years was only kept alive before the 1916 Rising by the endeavours of a small hardcore of activists. The national ideal, he said, had a hard struggle to live, and it was only by the superhuman efforts, he recalled, on the part of we, the few, that it was not utterly swamped. At this time, the notion of salvation, much like Pearse's writings, runs through Mellows' own writings, reproduced in the Na Fianna newspaper, with the perceived degradation of Irish public life, necessitating a shock treatment that would be administered by a rising generation of young militants. For Mellows and others, the enemy garrison in Ireland was actually the forces of conservative Irish nationalism and the cultural inferiority of the Irish middle classes. And the terms he used at this time included the targets, if you like, for young Republicans, the rotten Dublin press, parliamentarianism and the corruption that closely follows in its wake, the English influence of the so-called national schools, respectable people, as he called it, and of course, Shonini, or Little John Bulls, the West British element, he claimed, who sported the Union Jack as an emblem of their enslavement in Ireland. So the task before Liam Mellows, as he saw it as a young man, represented, as he termed it, the holy work of keeping the young manhood of Ireland out of the clutches of a British government that ground them down. The boys of Na Fianna, on the other hand, he asserted, would know that in a very short time, boys become men. And if when they lived up to the teachings and ambitions of their boyhood, the work of plotting and centuries to reduce and subdue Ireland would be undone. So this notion of Ireland as having been degraded itself and being to be renewed by the sacrifice of the young is actually very much something that comes to pass in many respects in the course of Mellows' own life. So when the Irish Volunteers are founded then in 1913 and later become the more radical group during the war, Mellows is to the forefront. He's a member of the organising committee. He's a full-time activist. He's a member of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, travelling to organise their groups at night time, while during the day he's organising Boy Scout groups, Na Fianna, and also volunteer corps in parishes across Ireland, all on his sturdy bicycle. In the events of Galway of Easter week 1916, events in Galway have traditionally been in the shadows, but over 300 volunteers were actually deported from the county in the aftermath of the 1916 rebellion, when Mellows himself led over 500 volunteers and 50 women of Cumann for almost 5 days in the East Galway countryside. Under Mellows' leadership, the group attacked the RIC at Clarnbridge, Oranmore and Carnmore, killing one policeman, Constable Patrick Whelan, and taking many RIC prisoner. The rebel force were given the run of the East Galway countryside, with the police later concluding in the official report on the rising that the Sinn Féin insurrection was so quickly put down and that it was confined to so few districts outside of the Dublin area must be ascribed to the fortunate arrest of Sir Roger Casement and the failure of the German ship to land the required arms and ammunition. There is no reason whatsoever to believe that if these arrangements had not miscarried, the Irish volunteers in Galway or any county would not have held back. The Easter Rising in Galway is to become one of those what-ifs. We have 500 well-drilled and armed men, led in many ways by the inspirational figure of Liam Mellows, and now they're out with just 38 rifles. They have very little ammunition. There's very little they can do, in fact. And as events in Dublin began to build momentum, the military are gearing up to dispatch to the west to deal with Mellows and his followers. So by the Friday of Easter week, Mellows and his group actually begun to believe that disbandment is the only way forward. Mellows himself refuses to give the order to disband the Galway rebels on Friday of Easter week. And one volunteer later explained, he actually begged myself to do so, saying that he was reluctant to ask a single man to go away. I then addressed the men, telling them decision and advising them to break up immediately and save their equipment for another day. Mellows did not address the men. He was very depressed. The news from Dublin had upset him greatly. This is the first great catastrophe, I think, in Mellows' militant activities. His deep father figure, Tom Clark, is executed. His closest comrades, many of them in Dublin, have died or have been killed. They've been jailed or deported. And here he is in the West, bereft of arms and unable to launch a meaningful revolt. In the aftermath of the rising, he becomes a wanted man, and the IRA leadership decide, after a number of months of hiding him on the mountainsides of the Slievachties of South Galway and into County Clare and then into Cork, that due to his ability as a public speaker and his sympathetic character, that New York would be the ideal place to keep him out of the clutches of the British government. His primary purpose in going to New York would be to organise shipments of weapons for the Irish volunteers' burgeoning revolution at home. However, his role quickly expanded to that as a public representative of the IRA, which entailed speaking at public meetings organised by the American Fenians, Clan na Gael, the family of the Irish, and their public face, the Friends of Irish Freedom, as well as other groups that he subsequently joins, the Irish Progressive League, and coming on in New York, very much under the leadership of a core group that included Nora O'Brien Connolly, the daughter of Liam of James Connolly, are key organisers along with Mellows of many meetings. Mellows was a talented orator and quickly found himself in high demand, and this is actually much to his own horror. He becomes for a time a celebrity amongst the Irish community, speaking to packed audiences at iconic venues, including the Central Opera House and Madison Square Garden. This is somewhat difficult to believe now, but back from 1917 to 1920 and even on into 21 and later, before the Civil War, the Irish become this star attraction in New York, in the Irish Revolutionaries. These iconic venues are packed to capacity as IRA leaders take to the stage. And we see Cumann on very prominent amongst them, more so I would argue than they are at home. So for instance, in one memorable meeting packed out the Central Opera House in the final week of World War I to demand the immediate release of Republican prisoners in Ireland. Liam Mellows took to the stage and in characteristic flourish told the audience, "Now that the war is ending, the Romanovs of Russia have gone. The Habsburgs of Austria-Hungary are gone. The House of Hohenzollern in Germany is gone. And then it will be said there is peace because the power of the German Empire is broken. But there can be no peace until another royal house, the House of Windsor, is gone. And with it, all the English aristocrats, the Lansdownes, the Milners, the Balfours, and the power of another empire that has rode roughshod over the peoples of the world, the British Empire, is gone. When that occurs, the world will be liberated from the foulest tyranny that has ever cursed it. From its ruins will arise a free India, a free Ireland, a free Egypt, and a free Africa." Mellows' uncompromising rhetoric. Of course, the United States was at war with its closest ally, Great Britain at this time, would alienate him from the American-born leadership of Clan na Gael and lead to his ostracization within Irish-American circles, loyal to the leadership of the Fenian leader in New York, John Devoy. After 4 unhappy years in America, Mellows returned to Ireland in late 1920, following the death of his father in July. In fact, the family of 6, the Mellows family, would suffer the loss of 4 members prematurely during these years. Liam's sister Jane died in 1906, aged 19, of bronchitis. His brother Fred died in 1914, aged 20, of tuberculosis. His father William died in the same disease in 1920. And with Liam executed, as we'll talk about, in December of 1922, the Mellows family of 6 would be reduced to just Barney and his mother Sarah by 1922. Liam's 4 years in the US was traumatic and necessitated a prolonged stay with the Carmelite Fathers in their Middletown seminary to recover from fatigue and exhaustion. Just as he had missed, if you like, the cataclysmic events in Dublin in 1916, through his organising work in Galway. I think during these great years of revolution and upheaval in Ireland, Mellows is again, if you like, marginalised by playing the role that he's asked to do in New York. And as he's missing the events at home once more, I think this takes a huge toll on his character. He dislikes America intensely. And in a letter home in 1920, he wrote, "The sooner the people of Ireland turn their eyes away from and give hope of securing their independence through America, the better. It is all cant, hypocrisy, and big talk, bluff from the start to finish, and can only at present be compared to Russia, previous to revolution. Free speech, action, even thought is denied. The capitalists run politics here. The whole system, commercial, financial, legal, and social, is built on graft. Honesty is an unknown quality. The bigger the bluff, the greater the man. The greater the rogue, the more wealthy, respected, and protected. Education here is very insufficient. The bulk of the Irish Americans are out of touch with Ireland and Irish ideals. Most of the former cannot conceive the present state of affairs at home because they left Ireland when it was rotten and their minds cannot arise above it. By the time of his return to Ireland, at the height of the War of Independence then, Mellows had been elected as a Member of Parliament for two constituencies. In the 1918 general election in South Galway and again in North Meath, and again in the uncontested election later on in May of 1921. However, Mellows never pretended to be a politician. In fact, he loathed politics and above all else espoused physical force as the sole engine of the Irish Revolution. Like his idol, Patrick Pearse, Mellows was unmarried, relatively puritanical in habits, and ruminated profoundly over his own actions, putting the cause of the Republic above all else. While he was a senior figure amongst the revolutionary elite, during these years he would remain an outsider within the coterie of leading militants. His new role on the GHQ of the IRA necessitated him disappearing into the shadows from late 1920 as he sought to organise and coordinate importations of arms from the UK and Europe, travelling frequently across Britain in disguise. As the conflict drew to its conclusion in July 1921, Mellows' distrust of Michael Collins and his unwillingness to stomach political compromise saw him drift further and further away from the IRA leadership, and as what he saw as the almost slavish cult of Michael Collins that was emerging in the Irish Republican Brotherhood, from which he personally had resigned due to his dislike of Collins. So Mellows' treaty contributions, these are the famous debates in Dáil Éireann in December and January of 1921 into January of 22, over whether or not to accept the Anglo-Irish Treaty, the compromise that brings the Irish War of Independence to a conclusion. I would argue represent classic distillations of Irish Republican thought. For Mellows, the establishment of the Free State represented nothing less than a repudiation of the Proclamation of Easter 1916 and the Declaration of Independence issued by the First Dáil Éireann in January 1919. For Mellows, the Republic existed, and by accepting the treaty, those promoting the establishment of the Free State were reneging on the Republic of Easter week. Now, either the Republic exists or it does not, Mellows claimed in Dáil Éireann. If the Republic exists, why are we talking about stepping towards the Republic by means of this treaty? Mellows' central contribution to these debates was to emphasize that ideological commitment to the Irish Republic should not be subverted by an adherence either to the will of the people, as Collins and others claimed, as the Republic was already a living, tangible thing, something for which men gave their lives, for which men were hanged, for which men are in jail, and for which the people have suffered, and for which men like us are still prepared to give their lives, he told the assemblage. Mellows emphatically rejected at this time economic arguments for political compromise as simply a repudiation of Irish nationhood, arguing that poverty and national honour was preferable to material wealth and national compromise. He claimed during the treaty debates, "We do not seek to make this country a materially great country at the expense of its honour in any way whatsoever. We would rather have this country poor and indigent. We would rather have the people of Ireland eking out a poor existence on the soil, as long as they possess their souls, their mind, and their honour." Mellows' critique of the Anglo-Irish Treaty also emphasised the nefarious role of British imperialism and the nature of colonialism. And I quote, "The British Empire represents to me nothing but the concentrated tyranny of ages. It means to me that terrible thing that has spread its tentacles all over the earth, that has crushed the lives out of people and exploited its own when it could not exploit anybody else. That British Empire is the thing that has crushed this country. Yet we are told that we are going into it now with our heads up. So the Anglo-Irish Treaty, as I said, was negotiated by Michael Collins and the Irish delegation in London in late 21, was, much to the horror of Liam Mellows and the other Republicans in Dáil Éireann, to be ratified by a majority of 64 to 57 in January of 1922, and brought the Irish War of Independence to a conclusion at the expense of splitting the Irish Volunteers, or IRA, into opposing factions that were to descend into a civil war that lasted from June of 22 till April of 23. Mellows was never going to contemplate supporting any political sentiment short of the Republic proclaimed at Easter 1916, and no amount of political assurances or bonds of comradeship would induce him, to compromise. The Civil War, however, was not simply about the treaty and whether it was a stepping stone to a republic or a compromise unworthy of the sacrifice of the Republican dead. From late 1921, most experienced volunteers' approach to the emerging split was dictated by their personal allegiances to the senior IRA officers with whom they had sacrificed and fought alongside. Senior IRA officers opposed to the treaty formed the Military Council in response to the signing of the treaty at the beginning of 1922, and notified the Free State Minister of Defence Richard Mulcahy that they intended holding an army convention representing the entire membership if one was not forthcoming within 2 months. Republicans opposed to the treaty intended to use this conference, which was stipulated under the IRA Constitution, to reaffirm the IRA's allegiance to the Irish Republic under the command of an executive appointed by the convention. Essentially, Republican officers before the outbreak of the Civil War believed that the IRA could revert to its original status as a volunteer force and be relieved of its perceived obligations to the new Free State, who they maintained, by adhering to the Anglo-Irish Treaty, had reneged on the Republic declared at Easter week. Mellows actually presided over the Army Convention that was attended by 211 officers from 49 IRA brigades and officially established the Irish Republican Army on the 26th of March 1922. The IRA was to be controlled by an executive of 16 members elected by ballot, from which an Army Council of 5 was elected. On the 9th of April, a second IRA convention, elected by an Army Council containing both militant and more conciliatory Republicans, was elected. Liam Mellows of Cork 1st Munster Division was Chief of Staff. Joseph McKelvey of West Belfast, 3rd Northern Division, Deputy Chief of Staff. Florence O'Donoghue, the Cork 1st Munster Division, was Adjutant General, and Liam Mellows, Quartermaster. Rory O'Connor, IRA GHQ, Director of Engineering, and Ernie O'Malley, based in Tipperary at this time, was to become Director of Organisation. The establishment of the new governing body marked a definitive break and a further step towards inevitable conflict. The new IRA executive occupied the extensive Four Courts complex on the Dublin Quays on the 13th of April 22. The occupation of the Four Courts was symbolic rather than tactical, providing Republicans with a central point of focus to rival the Free State government. According to Ernie O'Malley, we of the Four Courts were the centre of the armed Republican resistance. We had to defend the independence of our country, and whether we made mistakes or not, we were going to make a last attempt to prevent the stampede of the nation. Mellows continued to attend meetings of Dáil Éireann during this period, and speaking on the failed attempts at unity amongst the pro and anti-treaty factions. On the 3rd of May, he made a defiant speech rejecting the Free State Army leadership. He said, "No man is going to die for hypocrisy. No man is going to throw his life away for humbug. And if this is what the cause is going to become, then certainly some of us will not have anything to do with it." In the middle of May, he made another characteristically hardline speech. He said, "Seats in Dáil Éireann mean nothing to us. The Republic meant everything to us. That Declaration of Independence meant everything to us. If it was a question of unity being based upon 10 or 11 seats, the manly way for that to be done would be for those of us who were prepared, as am I, to resign in order to let anyone else have that seat, provided the principle is not impugned. The nation's honour comes before the nation's life. Other nations have found themselves in such positions. Some have backed down and gone the way that such nations deserve. Others have faced it and put their faith where we are prepared to put ours, despite the British Empire. We are prepared to put our faith in God, and as long as Ireland did that in the last 6 years, she won respect. So following a series of incidents between the pro and anti-treaty forces in the capital, the National Army commenced the shelling of the Four Courts garrison of the leadership of the IRA in the early hours of the 28th of June. On the morning of the attack, Rory O'Connor issued a communique redolent of the language that we employed by the IRA throughout the conflict. The boys are glorious, he said, and the fight for the Republic to the end. How long will our misguided former comrades outside attack those who stand for Ireland alone? The Free State Army besieging the Four Courts were labelled mercenaries wearing Irish uniforms, paid, equipped and armed by England and acting under England's orders, who are attacking our brothers of the Irish Republican Army, who defend the living Republic and will defend it to the death. Eventually, after 3 days of heavy bombardment, with the Four Courts collapsing around them, the IRA leadership were forced to resign. And again, much like Easter week of 1916, his time in America when the War of Independence was raging at home, the disappointment deeply affected Mellows. For others, however, it was the symbolism of the battle, rather than strategic or tactical concerns that were paramount. Ernie O'Malley later reflected, the fight to us had been symbolic, a symbol of resistance. We'd built a dream in our minds and the dream was there. Failure did not count. We evidently did not sense defeat. However, interned in Mountjoy jail, Mellows and the leadership of the IRA was to languish in confinement as the standoff between the National Army and the IRA descended into a squalid campaign of attrition, with atrocities committed by both sides in an intermittent struggle that was to last until April of 1923. The dispersed anti-treaty IRA fought under Liam Lynch localised campaigns in Munster, Connacht and parts of Leinster. Following his imprisonment in Mountjoy jail, however, Liam Mellows published a vociferous attack on the Irish Labour movement in the Workers' Republic, the newspaper of the Communist Party of Ireland. And it's at this point that his Republican socialism begins to foment. The article represented a new departure in his political analysis and reflects his disillusionment with the Irish Labour Party and the trade union movement, who had consistently opposed the IRA. They had urged workers to disavow militancy and warned them not to be used by the IRA. The publication of the article by Mellows by the Communist Party was noteworthy, as Mellows had no previous association with the group, and it's unclear if he had endeavoured to have it published in An Phoblacht, the IRA's daily bulletin, edited by Erskine Childers. Mellows' analysis was emblematic of the anger among sections of the IRA leadership, that their natural constituency, the working poor, had, as they saw it, been misled by the Labour Party and the trade unions, who they maintained had betrayed the Irish Republic by not supporting the Republican campaign. The unwilling. Mellows wrote, Ireland does not want a change of master. It would be a folly to destroy English tyranny in order to erect domestic tyranny that would need another revolution to free the people. The Irish Republic stands for the ownership, therefore, of Ireland by the people of Ireland. If the Irish people do not control Irish industries, transport, money, and the soil of the country, then foreign or domestic capitalists will. And whoever controls the wealth of a country and the processes by which wealth is attained controls its government. The Irish Republic is the People's Republic. Mellows' subsequent analysis of the political situation facing Republicans was prompted by a request from Ernie O'Malley for an outline of Mellows' military and national policy in July, and was subsequently smuggled from Mountjoy, becoming known as the Notes from Mountjoy jail the following month. They were captured by the Free State while in possession of a courier for Cumann and subsequently published by along with a commentary by the government, the Free State government's publicity department. The Free State argued that these dispatches proved that Liam Mellows and his comrades, in inverted commas, aimed to establish a communistic state in Ireland in which all industries, agriculture, transport and banks would be operated by state workers. The government contended that the seizure of land and resources advocated by Mellows is to be dangled before the eyes of the landless men, the unemployed, the thousands of people whom starvation is facing, so that the situation may be used for the Republic. In the long run, the Free State government propaganda argued, votes must be sought by the IRA, and accordingly votes are to be purchased by ruining the stake in the people country. To provide a bribe, they argued, for the men of no property, by persuading the Irish people that this was the aim of Wolfe Tone and of Dáil Éireann of 1990. So Mellows' identification of socialist thinking, of the seizure of land and resources, of creating a socialist state, are articulated in his notes from Mountjoy Jail. These two documents that reflect a profound change in Mellows' traditional republicanism, with its emphasis on militarism as the sole engine of change. Repudiated by the mainstream Republican movement and isolated from Republican fighters shouldering the battle on the outside, Mellows' analysis at this time represents an attempt to make republicanism relevant to the working poor through a coherent policy that starkly differentiated the IRA from the ambiguous position external association being propagated by Eamon de Valera. The analysis also represents a repudiation of the conservatism of the Catholic Church and the moderation of the Labour movement. So Mellows' final note captured from Mountjoy in September for his death represented another stepping stone in the foundation of modern Republican ideology and a central concept of Republican illegitimacy. In a note to Ernie O'Malley, he urged that the IRA set up a second government, if you like, a second Dáil alone, where Republicans would remained the only valid assembly of the Irish people, established as it was by the proclamation of Easter Week 1916 and endorsed in the 1918 election. He urged the position must be defined. The Free State equals capitalism and industrialism and empire. The Republic must equal workers and labour. In response to the IRA campaign, on the 15th of September, the Free State government sought the introduction of military courts capable of ordering the execution of IRA members. And within 10 days, the Emergency Powers Resolution was drafted and improved. Introducing the bill on the 27th of September, William Cosgrave denounced murderous attacks by Republicans and assured TDs, we are not going to treat IRA rebels as prisoners of war. The bill granted the state power to execute prisoners, which commenced with the shooting of 4 IRA volunteers in Kilmainham jail on the 17th of November. 81 prisoners, including 4 non-Republicans, would be executed in 28 rounds of executions between November 1922 and May of 23. Military courts could be convened by the general officer commanding any of the 8 command areas of the National Army, with sentences subject to the approval of a confirming authority. Trials were held in secret, with news of the sentences commuted to relatives after the executions were carried out. The pretext, however, for the execution of Mellows and his fellow hardline commanders Rory O'Connor, Joe McKelvey and Dick Barrett was the shooting of TD Sean Hales by the IRA on the Dublin Quays on the 7th of December. A farmer's son, Hales was at the forefront of the independence struggle as a member of the West Cork Fine column and experienced some of the most brutal episodes of the War of Independence. Hales was exceptional in that he was the only senior Republican commander in Cork to support the Anglo Irish Treaty, and during the Civil War defied local sentiment by organising the expulsion of the anti-treaty IRA from his native district. Hales's death provoked the National Army into a hastily convened crisis meeting, with Richard Mulcahy deciding upon the setting up of a system of military committees to deal summarily with persons arrested in possession of arms, ammunition, or explosives. The new committee system was established alongside the pre-existing military courts and now had the power to arbitrarily sentence chosen cases without any recourse to legal procedure provided for under existing legislation. All sentences of these new committees were subject to Army Council approval only, who were entitled to pose any sentence, including death, as they saw fit. The new military committees represent a decentralized operation of military rather than judicial procedure. This was to be extrajudicial murder. For the National Army leadership then, the execution of Mellows and his comrades was justifiable in terms of the threat they posed to the foundation of the new state. The executions represented their determination not to allow the old ties of comradeship to blind the new state from its responsibility to protect itself. We do have an account published almost 50 years after their deaths of the executions and the final moments of the four men from a Father Pigott. Father Pigott described the scene in the courtyard of Mountjoy Jail before Mellows' execution. He said, "In a few minutes we were all in the prison yard and the four, all brave and calm, were lined up before the firing squad. I gave a last absolution, and as I was having a final word with Rory and Liam, I saw Liam shuffle the gravel from under his feet so that he could stand up more firmly. I moved a few yards to the right, and as I did so, I heard Liam Mellows say his final words. Slán live, lads, his farewell to the firing party. In another instant, the sign was given, and the volley rang out. The men fell dead, and Canon McMahon and I anointed them where they lay on the ground. Two officers stood by to point out of pain anyone not already dead. McKelvey, who was conscious, needed attention, and I heard him call, 'Give me another,' and another. And then there was silence, a great silence." We have a copy of Liam Mellows' last letter to his mother, and it's worth quoting in detail. "My dearest mother, the time is short, and much that I would like to say must go unsaid. But you will understand in such moments heart speaks to heart. Though unworthy of the greatest human honour that can be paid to an Irish man or woman, I go to join Tone and Emmett, the Fenians, Tom Clark, Connolly, Pearce, Kevin Barry and Childers. You must not grieve, mother darling. Once before you thought you had given me to Ireland, the reality has now come. You will bear this as you have borne all the afflictions the cause of Ireland brought you, nobly and bravely. It is a sore trial for you, but that great courageous soul of yours will rejoice. For I die for the truth. Life is only for a little while, and we shall be reunited hereafter. I would write to Barney separately, but alas, he is not home. That he will be brave, I know, that he will persevere until the wrong is righted and the shadow of shame is lifted for his country, I do not doubt. May God bless and protect him and give him the courage, fortitude and wisdom necessary to adhere to truth and honour and principle. Through you, I send him my dearest love. Through you, I also send another message. It is this. Let no thought of revenge or reprisal animate Republicans because of our deaths. We die for the truth. Vindication will come and the midst will be cleared away, and brothers in blood will before long be brother once again in arms, against the oppressor of our country, imperialist England. In this belief I die happy, forgiving all as I hope myself to be forgiven. The path of the people of Ireland must tread is straight and broad and true, though narrow. Only by following it can they be men. It is a hard road, but it is the road our Saviour followed, the road of sacrifice. The Republic lives, our deaths make that a certainty. I had hoped that someday I might rest in some quiet place beside grandfather and grandmother in Castletown, not amid the worldly pomp of Glasnevin. But if it is to be the prison clay, it is all the sweeter, for many of our best lie here. I have had the chaplain to see me. It is sad, but I cannot agree to accept the bishop's pastoral. My conscience is quite clear, thank God. With the old Gaels, I believe that those who die for Ireland have no need of prayer. God bless, protect, and comfort you. Your loving son, Willie. In conclusion then, Isolated from the labour movement, rejected at the general election and cut off from the brutality of the Civil War, Mellows' socialist prison writings sought retrospectively to bring a clarity of analysis to the confused, fractured Republican position and regain the political ground with the rural poor and the urban working class, so clearly lost by many Republicans. The people had to be reconciled to the IRA campaign, and Mellows sought to bring the movement to a point of clarity of purpose by appealing specifically to the working poor. While he advocated socialist analysis at the final moments of his life, Mellows' religious faith and commitment to physical force were also the central tenets of his life, and he was above all else a traditional physical force Republican who saw his Catholicism as inseparable from his Irishness. He was also a troubled individual who hid his despair behind a mask of frivolity, and his letters reveal a haunted soul racked with self-doubt. His commitment to physical force was an inseparable component of his religious faith that reinforced his sense of predestination for martyrdom. Like many of his peers, he despised the stance of the Catholic bishops during the Civil War towards the IRA. However, his determination to defy the church hierarchy in his final moments by refusing absolution reflected his belief in the moral righteousness of the Republican cause and the distinction found so often amongst the devout between Catholic faith and the Catholic hierarchy. Mellows knew only too well that those who went before him amongst the Republican martyrs had been likewise condemned by their church, yet went to their deaths defiant. Liam Mellows, a true believer, had no fear of eternal damnation, for, as he assured his mother in the final moments of his life, those who die for Ireland have no need of prayer. Unlike the executions carried out in the aftermath of the Easter Rising, however, the executions carried out by the Free State would not transform popular political sentiment in deference to the dead. Mellows' belief in the capacity of the Irish people to support physical force in the face of political compromise would prove to be an illusion. There would be no second resurrection of the Irish people in 1923. Mellows and his comrades' executions and the narrative of Republican loss that followed reflected then the centrality of the good death in Irish republicanism, the defiant sacrifice of the warrior at the end of a life of struggle. Gur Magat.